Growing up, every summer in July/August, my family would get together and camp out for 2 weeks at White Lake State Park in Tamworth, New Hampshire. Some of my best childhood memories were made there. Rollerblading, Nerf gun wars, flashlight tag, and water balloon fights with my cousins and neighboring kids in the campground. When I was around my late teen years, my family stopped gathering together to camp out after my grandmother passed away. One of the last years I was there, this one particular memory has stuck with me. A little over 10 years ago, I was 16 years old. It was around 10 p.m. at night when I noticed I had a missed call on my cheapy little track phone. My family was sitting around the campfire cooking s'mores and sharing some laughs, so I decided to go off for some privacy to return the call. I took a long, narrow trail that winds in between other campsites that at the end leads up to the bathroom. I wasn't going up to the bathroom. I just wanted to find an empty campsite and sit at a picnic table to make my call. There were plenty of those since this whole side of the campground where I was heading was vacant. There were no other campers nearby in that area. It was quiet and dark, so I chose a campsite. I sat down at the table. The lights from the distant bathroom from up on top of the hill behind me were illuminating my surroundings just a little bit. I called my friend and was carrying on a conversation for around 20 minutes. As I'm sitting there, staring straight ahead, I see a silhouette coming down the road in front of me. The figure is coming towards my direction, where all these empty campsites are. I could see it was a person. It's not that unusual to see people strolling through the campground for a night walk. The people I see usually have flashlights, though. This person did not. I wasn't creeped out at this point. No reason to be. I was just watching curiously. As the person got closer, I could see a better outline and that it was a man I was looking at. I also noticed his pace slowed down. I kept my eyes fixated on him as I continued conversing on my cell phone. A minute or two passes, and now he stopped moving. He's just standing there in the road looking straight into the campsite where I am at. I don't know if he knew I could see him. He was staring at me, and I was staring right back at him. He was a little heavy-set and tall. I could also make out that he was wearing a light jacket. I couldn't see much for facial features, but I would guess I was staring at a man in his 30s or 40s. Alarm bells were going off in my head now. My mind had turned to mush at this point. I'm frozen. I was no longer listening to what my friend was saying on the phone. I was in a stare-off with this guy. Then he started to move again. He was tiptoeing towards me, very carefully, like he didn't want to make noise. He put one foot in front of the other, leaned forward in a slight hunch form. It looked like he was about to charge towards me. In that moment, I snapped out of that mind-mushy frozen state and leaped off the picnic table and started running through the campsite back towards the trail. I could hear him trampling behind me. Leaves scuffling, heavy yet fast footsteps. Footsteps were getting louder and closer. I made it back to that narrow trail. Once he got close to where I was, I heard the sound of twigs snapping and a oof noise that came from the man, which I can imagine maybe he tripped or almost tripped or maybe got face-slapped by a tree branch. Most likely he wasn't familiar with the trail like I was. Whatever the reason was, it caused him to stop chasing after me. I didn't stop to look back. I just kept running, and running until I made it back to my family's campsite. When I got back, they were still sharing laughs and smiles by the campfire. I broke down crying, and I was trembling. I explained what had just happened. My aunt spoke up and said, "Oh geez, he probably thought he knew you and was coming up to give you a good scare as a joke." She dismissed me. My cousin chimed in and said, "Yeah, he probably stopped running after he realized that he didn't actually know you. He probably feels dumb now." They all chuckled about it and changed the subject. I think I was dismissed because no one wanted the good vibes of the night to be ruined, and the fact that I'm just a socially anxious person in general. I'm very cautious and shy. For that time being, I let them convince me that I was just overreacting and overthinking. But here I am years later, looking back and shaking my head over this. I wish I was taken seriously, but other than that one thing happening, it was still a great trip. So I am a 26-year-old male, and I had been planning a camping trip with my wife and dad for a whole year. I wanted everything to be perfect, as we don't get away from town and dive deep into the woods as much as I'd like. This takes place in the very tree-dense Davy Crockett National Forest in East Texas. Earlier that day, My dad decided to go a little early and pick out a good spot for us to camp. To give a layout of where we camped, there were 2 dirt roads on either side of us and an overlook to the north of us. We camped in the middle between the 2 roads. My wife and I arrived and met my dad down there around 11 a.m. We set up camp and proceeded to enjoy the day until around dinner time, when we started to cook our meal for the evening. Right as we got done with dinner, we saw this truck circling around our campsite. He went around us several times and finally pulled right up into our camp and got out of his truck. He then proceeded to tell us that this was his family's campsite and how the firewood that was lying around was his. Now, in this particular forest, campsites are first come, first serve, and my dad had been there since 9 a.m. He then asked if he could camp next to us, and of course, being friendly, we said yes. We didn't know that when he said next to us, he meant directly on top of us. He backed his camper in so close to our tents and vehicles that he blocked my truck in. We weren't sure why he was doing this, being that there were so many other campsites available, but we just shrugged it off and tried to have a good time anyway. Not too long after that, we noticed a white Dodge dually circling around us. We had an off feeling from this truck because it went around several times, but we dismissed it because the area we were at was popular due to the overlook. After a long night of drinking and goofing off, we decided to go to bed. I was in a dead sleep when out of the woods I woke up to a blood-curdling scream. I jolted up and asked my wife, "What the heck was that?" About 30 seconds later, we hear another scream off in the distance. At this point, I grabbed my gun and unzipped the tent so we could see out. My dad had left a lantern burning so we could see a little ways into our campsite. At that moment, we saw the white Dodge dually tearing down the road behind us. They continued down the road until they were out of sight. We heard them stop and get out of their truck, slamming the door and screaming. Then they proceeded to get back in their truck and drive very slowly down the other road that was in front of our campsite. At this point, we were terrified, thinking they were coming to rob us, but they kept driving until they were out of sight. Then we heard them shooting. After the gunshots ended, they sped off. At this point, we thought that maybe they were just drunk and acting stupid, so we didn't call the cops, and we didn't have a signal anyway. We just tried to go back to sleep. The next day, we had to make a beer run for my dad. When we made it out of the camping area and hit the main highway, there were police everywhere. They had stopped 2 young boys. We assumed they were the ones who were being troublemakers the night before and continued on into town. When we got back to our campsite, the cops were leaving after talking to my dad. They told my dad that the guys in the white dually had gone into the young guys' camp while they were hunting and were robbing them. The boys walked up on their camp being robbed, and the dually guys pulled guns on the young boys, proceeding to rob the young boys at gunpoint. We think if it hadn't been for the people that camped right on top of us, as strange as it was, they would have robbed us instead. They made our campsite look bigger than it actually was. The people in the white dually were never caught. I have been a scout since I was 8 years old, and last year I was the leader of my team, so I had to do all the paperwork and make calls to find places to camp. It was mid-November, and I had to find a place to camp. But since I was lazy, I decided to wait a week before the actual weekend. A week before the weekend, I decided to call some owners so I could secure a place to sleep. As I called many numbers, all of the owners were unavailable or simply not there. But then I noticed a number I had never called before, since it was at the end of the list. I called, and an old lady picked up the phone. I did the basic introductions and all. She agreed to let me and my team stay at her property, and we made agreements. In the afternoon, I went to her property to check everything, such as potable water, the tent location, and the campfire area. The place is somewhat dark but nice. The week passed and Saturday arrived. The Saturday ended well. We played great games, ate a lot, and enjoyed a good night show. As my team went to sleep in the tent, I stayed awake to finish paperwork for the next day. It was now midnight, and I decided to go to sleep because we had to wake up early for church. As I switched off the flashlight, one of my newcomers, we were 8 in total, wanted to go to the restroom, aka a tree, and asked me to accompany her. I understood because it's better to have company at night, especially in the woods. She did her business, and suddenly I heard some noises not too far away. I told myself it's nothing, probably just some animals searching for food. We went back to the tent. And that's when I heard footsteps approaching. As I heard those footsteps, I remained calm and thought, maybe it's the old lady checking if we didn't make the fire too close or something. But I still had an odd feeling because it was midnight, and why would she do this at this hour? Then I didn't hear footsteps for about 10 minutes, and then I heard more coming towards our tents. Luckily, all of my girls were sleeping, because they would have been scared. I was the oldest one. They were about 3 or 4 years younger. As I heard footsteps that seemed to come from one person, I heard others from the back of the tent, and I thought, okay, this is getting weird. I need to do something. I checked the tent from the inside, and thankfully, one of my newcomers had left some embers from the fire, so I could see what was happening between the fire and the zipper of my tent. A minute passed, and a silhouette appeared just between the fire and my tent. I stopped breathing. I literally froze. I started moving towards my phone when I saw the silhouette coming closer to the zipper of the tent. I sent a message to one of my leaders who were camping nearby if something happened. But I knew she would take too long, so I had to think of something, and think fast. That's when I had an idea. I set my alarm to a loud siren, like the ones we used for night games sometimes. So I put on my bell, and my girls woke up. The silhouette had started to unzip. I actually saw fingers from below. But as the silhouette heard my girls waking up, he or she quickly ran back to where they came from. That's when I saw 2 other silhouettes sprinting back in the same direction. Everything ended well. 20 minutes later, my leader arrived and stayed the night, and I never had to deal with those silhouettes again, thankfully.